In less than 1 week, the man who controlled the largest repressive apparatus of the Third Reich went from having absolute power to becoming a fugitive without command. His fall was immediate, his isolation total, and his name became a burden even for his own followers. No German authority wanted to receive him. No ally agreed to listen to him. After the surrender, Himmler tried to escape among thousands of defeated soldiers. He used false identities, crossed checkpoints, and sought a negotiation that never existed. Each move revealed the collapse of his influence. When the British captured him, he was no longer a leader. He was a prisoner with one last hidden decision: to avoid any trial with poison. His capture exposed the disorderly end of the system he had led for years. How did the man who led the terror of the Reich fall to become an irrelevant fugitive? Why did he choose suicide instead of facing a court? Collapse of power, the fall of the Reich, and the withdrawal of Himmler. In the spring of 1945, the power structure that Heinrich Himmler had built over more than a decade began to crumble with a speed that even he had not anticipated. For years he had concentrated an unprecedented repressive apparatus in his hands: the SS, the Gestapo, the network of concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppen, and a surveillance system that penetrated every corner of the Third Reich. But when the Soviet offensive crossed the Vistula in January of 1945, opening an irreversible breach in the Eastern Front, that entire monumental structure began to fragment. Himmler's appointment as commander of Army Group Vistula was not based on military criteria, but on Hitler's fanatical trust in his closest collaborators. However, the following weeks demonstrated his absolute inability to lead large-scale operations. He clung to maps and reports, while the units under his command dissolved in chaotic retreat. This failure eroded his authority even among the SS officers, who until then had considered him untouchable. When he was discreetly relieved from the front and sent back to Berlin, his political position had already been irreversibly weakened. The leadership of the SS formally continued to depend on him, but the machinery he had administered with bureaucratic precision was working increasingly worse. The field commanders began to act autonomously, seeking to escape, destroy documents, or avoid being captured. The hierarchical chains were breaking apart in all directions. By the end of March, the reports reaching SS headquarters showed that most of the camps in the east were already inaccessible due to the Soviet advance. The forced evacuations were saturating the roads and turning the retreat into a scenario where discipline had completely eroded. Himmler received reports from commanders urgently requesting instructions, but his control over the system became almost symbolic. At the same time, his relationship with Hitler began to deteriorate definitively. Throughout the entire war, Himmler had cultivated an image of a loyal and obedient servant. But in private, he dreamed of a broader political role and believed that his position could make him a possible negotiator for achieving a partial peace. This self-deception intensified as defeat became inevitable. In April, when the Soviet forces had already crossed the Oder and the Anglo-Americans were pressing from the west, Himmler began to discreetly probe communication channels with neutral countries. He believed he could present himself as the figure that would guarantee order in a post-Hitler Germany. To do this, he needed to persuade the Allies that he represented a stable alternative to the Führer's leadership. This idea was devoid of any foundation. It was impossible for the Allies to agree to negotiate with the main person responsible for the European extermination system. Nevertheless, Himmler persisted in this political fantasy, convinced that his status as head of the SS was not as well known as he feared. The critical point occurred when Hitler received confirmation that Himmler had tried to contact the Western Allies through Count Volker Bernadotte. What Himmler saw as a smart diplomatic move was interpreted by Hitler as an unacceptable betrayal. The Führer, already locked in his bunker and surrounded by the sound of Soviet artillery, reacted with fury. On the 28th of April, he ordered Himmler to be removed from all his duties and expelled him from the Nazi Party. This order marked the definitive break between them and left Himmler as a political fugitive who no longer had real power over anything. To understand the magnitude of this fall, It is necessary to observe the psychological transition he experienced in those days. For years he had lived immersed in an ideological narrative where he considered himself a defender of a racial order and an indispensable servant of the National Socialist project. But, with his dismissal, that self-image was crushed. What he had slowly built crumbled in a matter of hours. The SS, which he had conceived as an ideological elite destined to last for centuries, were now becoming scattered groups of soldiers only looking to survive or escape. The atmosphere in Berlin contributed to intensify this feeling. The city was already a field of ruins. Columns of smoke rose over the central neighborhoods. The historic buildings were destroyed, and the civilian population moved between shelters while the explosions constantly shook the air. The communications between the different government departments were intermittent, and the Führer's orders arrived late when they were not directly contradictory. Himmler observed all this from the outside, without access to the bunker and without the ability to change anything. When he received the news that Hitler had appointed Karl Dönitz as his successor in northern Germany, he understood that any possibility of regaining influence had disappeared. Although he still retained loyal escorts and documents that accredited his rank, in practice he no longer held a position within the state. The authority he had wielded for more than 10 years had been reduced to an empty title. His immediate reaction was to try to maintain the appearance of control. He ordered some subordinates to defend offices, secure archives, or ensure evacuations. But these instructions only had limited effect. In parallel, Himmler tried to assess the options for his personal survival. He knew that the Allies possessed sufficient information to consider him one of the main perpetrators of mass crimes. He was aware of the reports intercepted by British intelligence about the Einsatzgruppen, knew that the evacuations of camps had left traces of atrocities, and was conscious that his signature appeared on numerous logistical orders related to systematic deportations. Although he trusted that part of his role might be diluted in the final confusion, he understood that he was too exposed. The fact that Hitler called him a traitor had a devastating impact on his self-esteem. The regime had cultivated a closed moral system where loyalty to the Führer was the ultimate measure of personal worth. Being labelled a traitor was equivalent to losing all legitimacy even before subordinates who had served him for years. Many SS members abandoned him as soon as they learned of the dismissal. Officers who once bowed to him now strove to dissociate themselves, destroy compromising documents, or escape to areas that might fall under Anglo-American administration. As Berlin was sinking and the Reich was collapsing from within, Himmler made a decision that marked the beginning of his life as a fugitive, to abandon the public representation of his office. He stored his official documents, dressed in a simplified uniform, and moved north, seeking regions still controlled by forces that might be more receptive to his negotiation attempts. It was in that initial transit, still full of contradictions and unrealistic expectations, that he understood the magnitude of the political isolation in which he found himself. The fall of the Reich was not only manifested in military defeat, it was also expressed in the dissolution of internal power networks. Commanders who for years had operated under a rigid system deserted or surrendered. Administrative offices burned files to avoid incrimination. Ministries stopped coordinating. In that chaos, Himmler tried to reconstruct some type of authority, but each attempt found only fragments of a structure that no longer responded to any center. His figure, once feared and respected, became a shadow, trying to find a place in a non-existent state. The transformation was total. By the end of April of 1945, Himmler went from being one of the most powerful men in Europe to becoming a secondary actor on a stage dominated by disintegration. He had no allies, no access to the Führer, no effective command over significant troops, and he did not have a viable plan. Internally, he tried to convince himself that he could still influence the future, but every step he took proved otherwise. The fugitive, escape disguises, and the futile search for a political way out. When Heinrich Himmler left Berlin at the end of April of 1945, he did so with the conviction that he could still influence the destiny of Germany. Although he had already been expelled from Hitler's circle of trust and stripped of all his positions, he clung to the idea that his administrative experience, his ability to impose order, and his historical position within the regime could make him a useful intermediary for the Western Allies. That illusion, based more on his distorted perception of himself than on political reality, marked each of the movements he made from that moment until his arrest 3 weeks later. Himmler's first objective was to keep moving to avoid falling into the hands of the Soviets. For years he had been aware of the devastating impact that the SS had had on the Eastern territories. He knew that Soviet justice would be relentless, and that, if captured by the Red Army, his fate would be sealed without the possibility of negotiation. For that reason, he directed his escape toward northern Germany, a region where disorganized German units still operated and where the British forces were closer than the Soviets. For him, the British presence represented a minimal hope, but at least it offered him the possibility of being heard before being judged. In those early days, Himmler still had considerable resources. He had a small number of SS escorts who had decided to follow him even after his dismissal. Among them was Werner Grothmann, his personal assistant, a man who had remained by his side for years and who knew all aspects of his public and private life. He was also accompanied by Heinz Macher, a young and loyal officer who had participated in the destruction of sensitive documents and in the evacuation of key SS offices. These men represented the last vestige of the power structure that Himmler had managed, but even they knew that the journey had no clear destination. As he advanced north, Himmler tried to maintain the appearance of authority. He wore a Waffen-SS general's uniform and carried documents that demonstrated his rank. However, he was aware that this image could become a burden if intercepted by enemy forces. In an environment where thousands of captured officers sought to avoid being identified, wearing an SS uniform was almost the same as a prior sentence. Therefore, the possibility of adopting a false identity arose from the beginning, although Himmler was not yet ready to part with the symbols that had represented his power for so many years. The military collapse of the Reich favored his initial movement. The roads were full of retreating soldiers, civilians fleeing the Soviet advance, evacuated ministry officials, and small armed groups operating without coordination. In the midst of this constant flow, Himmler could move without attracting attention, as long as he avoided the intensely monitored checkpoints. The fragmentation of the chain of command allowed many units not to know whom they should stop or which documents they should check. This confusion allowed him to move towards the region of Schleswig-Holstein, where he believed he could establish contact with the provisional government of Karl Dönitz. Himmler remained convinced that Dönitz needed him, or at least that he could not do without him. For years, he had built the image of being indispensable for the internal security of the Reich, a competent administrator who understood the police structure and the state's control mechanisms better than anyone. He believed that, once Hitler was dead, his experience could be useful to maintain order in a devastated country. This interpretation of his own role completely ignored the fact that Dönitz and the rest of the new government considered him a dangerous burden. The Allied powers had already identified him as one of the main leaders of the Nazi repression system, and any attempt to incorporate him into the government would have been interpreted as a sign of continuity with the previous regime. The political reality was much more complex than Himmler imagined. Dönitz had assumed power with a clear mandate: to negotiate the German surrender in the best possible conditions and to prevent total chaos from taking over the territory still under German control. In that context, Himmler's presence was more of an obstacle than an advantage. His name was directly associated with the most serious crimes of the regime, and the Allies had made it clear that there would be no negotiation with figures involved in systematic extermination. Dönitz knew this and had made the decision to maintain absolute distance from the former Reichsführer SS. However, Himmler decided to continue with that strategy. He tried to approach the city of Flensburg, where Dönitz had established his headquarters, but found all the access points controlled by officers who were responding to strict orders not to allow him entry. Some knew that Hitler had dismissed him, Others simply did not want to be associated with a figure whose reputation was already marked by crimes that no one wanted to carry with them. For the first time in more than a decade, Himmler had to face open rejection by German officers. The policy of obsequious obedience that had surrounded his figure disappeared suddenly. He had lost all command capability. It was at that moment when he accepted that he had to adopt a false identity. His escorts prepared a disguise based on a mix of military clothing and civilian pieces. The goal was to avoid drawing attention without appearing completely out of place. He chose the fictitious name Heinrich Himmler, supposedly a non-commissioned officer of the military police. The name was chosen because it sounded common and because it matched the letter H of his monogram, which made its use in improvised documents easier. Himmler also wore a bandage over his left eye, claiming a recent injury, which allowed him to divert attention from his face and justify a tired appearance. This bandage was a key element to reduce the possibility of being recognized, as his gaze, especially his round glasses, had been one of his most characteristic features for years. With this new identity, Himmler integrated himself into a column of retreating soldiers that was moving northward. The idea was to move within a constant human flow where going unnoticed would be easier. However, the transition was not easy. Himmler was not accustomed to being treated as a low-ranking soldier. For years he had lived in an environment of continuous service, where every need was attended to by his assistants. Now he had to carry his own luggage, walk long distances, endure food shortages, and share space with men who did not know who he was. This forced change confronted him with a reality he had never experienced, that of the common man subjected to the uncertainty of the end of the war. During the march, Himmler tried to observe without being seen. He wanted to understand in what state the country he had administered was, and what kind of political environment he would find if he came to negotiate with the British. What he saw was a destroyed country, towns razed, roads full of remains of abandoned vehicles, exhausted civilians walking without knowing where to go, soldiers who no longer obeyed orders and often preferred to surrender rather than continue fighting. The troops' morale was completely broken. Many knew that the war had ended even before the formal capitulation, and only sought an opportunity to survive. The landscape they were traversing reflected the magnitude of the German defeat. The agricultural fields were abandoned, the farms destroyed or looted, the bridges blown up to delay the Allied advance. In some villages, the inhabitants had hung white flags as a sign of early surrender, hoping that British or American forces would arrive before the Soviets. In others, small groups of fanatical Nazis attempted to organize futile defenses that only prolonged the suffering of the civilian population. Himmler observed all of this with a mix of incredulity and resentment, unable to accept that the project in which he had invested his entire adult life was collapsing so completely. Despite his disguise and his attempt to blend in with the crowd, Himmler could not stop behaving like a figure of authority. Several times he intervened to suggest alternative routes, reorganize small groups, or prevent disputes among soldiers. These gestures caught the attention of some members of the column, although none suspected that it was the former Reichsführer SS. His manner of speaking, however, remained that of an officer accustomed to giving orders, which made him stand out more than was convenient. Grothmann had to remind him several times that he should maintain a lower profile, avoid giving instructions, and limit his interventions to the minimum necessary. In parallel to these movements, Himmler continued to nurture the idea that he could still offer himself as a negotiator to the British. His reasoning was simple. If he managed to get under British custody before all the details about the crimes of the system he had directed became public, he could present himself as a political interlocutor and not just as an administrative responsible for the extermination. This logic ignored the fact that numerous documents had already been seized and that testimonies from survivors of the camps were beginning to circulate among the Allies. The extent of his crimes could no longer be hidden. The march towards the north continued for several days. Himmler avoided the main roads, aware that the British were establishing increasingly strict controls to identify members of the SS and other high-ranking officials of the regime. The country was full of reports about Nazi figures trying to escape in disguise, which turned each checkpoint into a critical point. Himmler had to present his false identification, maintain a coherent story, and avoid any gesture that would give him away. He managed to do so for a long time, helped by the general exhaustion and the endless flow of disoriented soldiers. Nights were particularly difficult. When they camped in improvised spaces, Himmler stayed awake longer than the others, reviewing his documents, reorganizing his belongings, or whispering briefly with Grothmann. The distance between them had been considerably reduced. The implicit authority that Himmler exercised over his assistants was still present, but now it was tinged with fragility. All three knew that any mistake could lead to immediate arrest. In those moments of nocturnal wakefulness, Himmler reflected on his situation with a lucidity that during the day he tried to repress. He understood that he was fleeing not only from the Allies, but also from his own past, from the decisions he had made and the consequences that now pursued him. As he advanced towards the limits of the region controlled by the British, Himmler tried to assess his possibilities one last time. He knew he could not approach Flensburg or any German military installation, as his name was on the most wanted lists. He also dismissed the possibility of fleeing abroad. The routes to Denmark were closed, and there was no neutral country willing to receive a man with his background. He had only one option left: surrender under conditions that would allow him to try to influence his treatment as a prisoner. This strategy led him to deliberately approach an area where British controls were established, but without announcing his identity. He intended for his arrest to be routine, for the British to process him as just another soldier, and then, once in a more controlled environment, he would identify himself to engage in a dialogue with a high-ranking officer. It was a plan built on a series of erroneous assumptions, but Himmler had no other alternative. His days as a fugitive were coming to an end, although he did not yet know this for sure. Step by step towards capture, the final days before the British arrest. In mid-May of 1945, Heinrich Himmler's situation had been reduced to a degree of vulnerability that he himself would never have considered possible years earlier. With the Reich officially surrendered, the state's structures fragmented, and most of his former collaborators dead, fugitives or already in Allied custody, the last days before his capture became a journey marked by fear, improvisation, and a series of errors that he failed to interpret in time. Himmler was moving toward the north of Germany, believing he was still in control of his destiny, when in reality he was walking through territory completely controlled by powers that had already decided there would be no possible negotiation with any leader of the Nazi extermination apparatus. After leaving the main column of soldiers with which he had integrated, Himmler and his companions, Werner Grothmann and Heinz Macher, began to move in small groups, constantly changing direction to avoid the more intense movements of British troops. Their attempts to go unnoticed were conditioned by the ongoing need to find food, places to rest for a few hours, and routes that would not lead them to sectors where exhaustive searches were conducted. In those days, hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war and displaced persons were moving uncontrollably across the territory, creating a chaotic environment that could favor anonymity, but also increase the likelihood of unexpected encounters with British patrols. In this context, Himmler made a fundamental strategic mistake. He underestimated the effectiveness with which the Allies were carrying out the process of identifying war criminals. Although the war had officially ended on May 8th, the British forces had established a quick and organized system to detect members of the SS, the Gestapo, and the Nazi Party. All checkpoints were instructed to pay attention to nervous behaviors, suspicious documents, altered uniforms, and incoherent explanations. Himmler was unaware of the magnitude of these procedures and continued to act as if the fragmentation of the German army meant that the same disorder affected the enemy forces. He believed he could take advantage of the chaos, when in reality he was moving within an extremely active surveillance network. The British had developed a systematic method for identifying high-ranking officers who were trying to hide. Each checkpoint had updated lists of wanted individuals, photographs of key Nazi leaders, and personnel trained to detect inconsistencies in forged documentation. Additionally, they had established specific protocols to search any individual wearing SS insignia, scars from removed tattoos, or physical characteristics that matched descriptions of known war criminals. This level of organization starkly contrasted with the chaos that reigned on the German side, creating an asymmetry that Himmler had not calculated correctly. The costume he wore consisted of a mix of civilian clothing and some parts of a uniform. He kept his round glasses. A distinctive feature he attempted to neutralize by wearing a bandage over his left eye, which made him appear injured and justified a shabby appearance. He also carried documents identifying him as Heinrich Himmler, a supposed non-commissioned officer of the military police. These papers had a rudimentary yet convincing level of fabrication at first glance, especially in a context where the British were overwhelmed processing thousands of German military personnel each day. However, this costume had a critical vulnerability. Himmler did not know in depth the bureaucratic details corresponding to the rank and unit he claimed to represent. This meant that, in the face of any meticulous British officer, he could make fatal mistakes. During these last days, Himmler and his companions constantly changed their route to avoid roads where they saw large columns of captured German soldiers. They knew that those groups were subjected to more rigorous scrutiny and feared that the pressure of the Czechs would eventually expose them. Himmler walked long distances on foot, something he was not accustomed to, and that unusual physical effort left him exhausted. Before his escape, he had lived for years in a sheltered environment, with permanent transportation, regular meals, and medical attention. The lack of these basic comforts weakened him quickly, making each day of travel more difficult than the previous one. The physical exhaustion was beginning to show in his appearance. His face showed clear signs of extreme fatigue, deep circles under the eyes, pale skin, chapped lips, and a permanently tense expression that was difficult to hide. His movements had become slower and clumsier, and at times he needed to stop to catch his breath. Grothmann and Macker watched this deterioration with concern, aware that a visibly weakened Himmler would attract more attention at the checkpoints. They tried to persuade him to rest longer, but he insisted on continuing to move, obsessed with the idea that each hour lost reduced his chances of reaching a point where he could negotiate his surrender. Despite his fatigue, Himmler maintained a constant obsession with assessing any possible route that could lead him to a favorable position against the British. He remained convinced that, at some point, he could reveal his identity to an Allied officer who was willing to listen to him. This illusion was strengthened every time he managed to get past a checkpoint, or when any British soldier barely showed interest in checking his documents. For him, every small success reinforced the belief that he still had some room to maneuver. But this interpretation was not based on reality, but on the desperate need to find a way out. The Himmler group decided to head toward the Bremervörde region, where British troop movements had been reported, but also wide areas were still without constant patrolling. Their objective was to reach an area where they could surrender without too much initial attention. They were looking for a place where they would not be rigorously searched, and where they could later make a self-declaration of identity under more controlled conditions. This strategy was completely wrong, as the British had already received orders to capture any high-ranking suspect and carry out detailed checks even in seemingly routine cases. The transit towards Bremervörde was full of obstacles. On several occasions, Himmler and his companions encountered small German detachments that did not know whether they should surrender or resist. These groups, nervous and disoriented, could become dangerous if they discovered the fugitive's identity. Himmler avoided interacting with them as much as possible, crossing secondary roads or going around villages to reduce risks. Each encounter was a moment of increasing tension, since any German soldier, out of desperation or interest, could try to hand him over to the Allies in exchange for a favorable deal. The landscape they were passing through reflected the complete devastation of northern Germany. The forests were filled with refugees who had built makeshift camps. The secondary roads showed signs of recent battles, bomb craters, destroyed military vehicles, abandoned trenches. In some areas, the bodies of German soldiers remained unburied, a silent testament to the last skirmishes before the surrender. This vision of the total collapse of the country he had administered for years generated in Himmler a mix of disbelief and bitterness that he tried unsuccessfully to suppress. As they advanced, Himmler began to show signs of deep psychological tension. He would spend long silences staring at the road, spoke little, and overly relied on the initiative of Grothmann and Macker. This situation contrasted with the man who had led vast repressive structures with absolute authority. Isolation, fatigue, and partial awareness of the inevitability of his capture had begun to erode his decision-making capacity. Although he continued to give instructions, these were increasingly imprecise and responded more to his emotional state than to a realistic analysis. Even his posture had changed. He walked hunched over with slow movements and frequent pauses. A critical moment occurred when the group approached the Oster River. The region was controlled by British troops who had established a network of inspection posts to screen former SS members. Himmler and his escorts had to wait for several hours in a wooded area while observing the constant passage of German prisoners being escorted by British soldiers. During that time, Himmler reflected on his options and concluded that he could not turn back. He knew that the Allied encirclement was tightening more each day. His only strategy was to continue northward and hope that at some point the British control would be less severe. The decision to continue toward Bremerwörde was probably one of the most important and most unfortunate moves he made in his final hours as a fugitive. On the 21st of May 1945, Himmler and his two companions approached a British checkpoint, trusting that their worn-out appearance and false documents would be sufficient to avoid suspicion. At first glance, the group seemed similar to hundreds of small German contingents wandering aimlessly after the surrender. However, the entrance to the post was guarded by members of the British Military Intelligence Service, who had received strict orders to subject anyone exhibiting signs of having been part of special units, including military police non-commissioned officers, to more intensive scrutiny. The first indication of danger occurred when a British soldier noticed that Himmler avoided direct eye contact, despite his supposed rank. Most German non-commissioned officers, even in defeat, maintained a more upright posture and a more formal attitude at military checkpoints. Himmler, on the other hand, displayed an obvious nervousness that contrasted with his stated history. Additionally, his bandage over the left eye attracted attention, as it showed no signs of a recent wound. This discrepancy generated an initial doubt, sufficient for the British to decide to separate him from the group. When the soldiers asked to check their documents, Himmler handed them over without hesitation, trying to appear confident. However, his identification had incorrect details in administrative aspects that could go unnoticed by an average German officer, but not by the British, who had gathered detailed information about the structure of the German military police. Given the inconsistency of his papers, they decided to take him along with his companions to a stricter inspection area. It was at this moment that Himmler realized that the room for maneuver had been reduced to almost zero. The British noticed several additional suspicious elements. The clothes Himmler was wearing, although they appeared civilian, retained stitching and buttons, suggesting they had been part of a military uniform of superior quality to that of a simple, non-commissioned officer. His hands, furthermore, did not show the calluses typical of someone who had worked in the field or performed intensive physical labor during the war. They were the hands of a bureaucrat, soft and cared for, incompatible with the story his documentation intended to tell. These small details, seemingly insignificant, accumulated to form a picture of inconsistencies that could not be ignored. Even so, Himmler tried to maintain composure. During the journey to the control building, he kept a rigid expression and avoided commenting with his companions on the obvious. The identification process had started to work against him. He tried to persuade himself that he could still reverse the situation by presenting himself as an officer willing to cooperate, but his own behavior betrayed him. The British soldiers noticed that his step was irregular, that he seemed focused on hiding the area of his mouth, and that he spoke with an unnecessarily low voice, behaviors that, combined, aroused even more unease. Upon arriving at the identification station, he was asked to remove his glasses and blindfold for a medical inspection. It was this moment that marked the beginning of the end. Himmler knew that his face was known, that there were recent photographs distributed among the Allies, and that any officer with basic training could recognize him. His response was to delay the inspection with small gestures, slowly moving his hands, pretending discomfort, adjusting his clothing. But these maneuvers only increased suspicion. A British officer requested that his mouth be examined, a standard procedure to identify cyanide capsules. Himmler's reflexive movement of tightly closing his lips was too obvious. From that moment, the British no longer had any doubts that it was someone important. They still did not know exactly who, but they recognized that his behavior was not that of any ordinary non-commissioned officer. They ordered his immediate transfer to a more rigorous interrogation point in the town of Westertimke. It was there where, finally, Himmler's attempts to preserve his false identity completely collapsed. However, the exact moment when the British pronounced his name, and he could no longer deny it, already belongs to the next stage of this story: the formal arrest, the revelation of identity, and the last minutes of life of the architect of the Nazi extermination system. The arrest, identification, initial interrogation, and psychological breakdown. The transfer of Heinrich Himmler to the interrogation center in Westertimke marked the beginning of his direct confrontation with the reality he had been avoiding since the fall of the Reich. Until that moment, he had still allowed himself to believe that he could control his destiny through discretion, cunning, or mere luck. But once separated from the flow of ordinary prisoners and led under stricter British surveillance, that illusion began to disintegrate quickly. The officers guarding him did not yet know what his real identity was, but they sensed that the man they had detained was not just any soldier trying to return home. There was an abnormal tension in him, a watchful body language, an internal intensity difficult to hide. When he arrived at the registration center, the British took him to a room where they processed individuals considered suspicious or of special interest. It was an improvised military building, adapted for the constant flow of prisoners who had to be identified, classified, and sent to different destinations. In that austere space, filled with folding tables, boxes of documents, filing cabinets, and lamps hanging from exposed wires, Himmler realized he was crossing a decisive threshold. Unlike the earlier checks, where he could rely on remaining unnoticed, he no longer had the possibility of blending into the crowd. He was alone, under the direct gaze of trained officers, and his fate depended on his ability to sustain a lie that he himself knew was weakening. The British began the usual procedure: document review, physical verification, behavior analysis, and identity confirmation through records. The first step was simple. They asked him for his identification again, and he once more presented the documents of Heinrich Himmler. The officer who examined them, a member of the military intelligence service, immediately detected that the papers were too rudimentary. Although he could not ensure they were fake, the general impression was that they did not match the usual standards of the German military police. The administrative inconsistencies, as well as the uneven deterioration of the paper, made it evident that the identification might have been recently fabricated. This was not enough to conclude a forgery, but it was enough to justify a more thorough examination. The British officer examined every detail of the documents with meticulousness. He compared the attached photograph with the prisoner's face, observed the signatures and official seals looking for irregularities, checked the issuance dates, and verified if the information contained corresponded with the records that the British had compiled about the different units of the German military police. Each of these steps increased the tension in the room. Himmler remained seated, motionless, aware that any nervous gesture could betray his anxiety. He tried to control his breathing, keep his hands still, and maintain a neutral expression. But the very effort to appear calm generated a bodily rigidity that seemed suspicious. The next step was the physical examination. Himmler was escorted to a table where a British doctor responsible for inspecting the prisoners awaited him. The methods were straightforward: check for wounds, identify possible signs of recent fights, check for signs of poisoning or illness. When he was asked to remove the eye bandage, Himmler hesitated for a moment. That hesitation, although brief, was enough to increase suspicions. Upon removing the bandage, it became clear that there was no serious wound underneath. The skin was slightly irritated by the friction of the bandage, but there were no bruises or scars. The doctor said nothing but noted the detail, aware that those in disguise often exaggerated injuries to distract attention. Next, they asked him to open his mouth. This procedure had become one of the priorities of the Allied personnel. Since they knew that many high-ranking Nazi officers carried cyanide capsules hidden among their teeth or embedded in improvised devices. Himmler reacted immediately. He pressed his lips tightly, lowered his head slightly, and tried to buy a few seconds. It was this defensive gesture that definitively caught the attention of the commanding officer. A soldier who truly had nothing to hide would have complied with the order without resistance. Himmler's silent refusal was an unequivocal sign that there was something more behind his declared identity. The British insisted firmly. They ordered several soldiers to partially restrain him, not with violence, but by placing themselves on both sides to limit his movements. Himmler knew that the oral inspection was imminent, and that, if the capsule hidden among his molars was discovered, the entire facade of his disguise would collapse. This discovery, however, was not necessary for the British to decide that he had to be isolated. The suspicion was already sufficient. He was taken to a smaller room where he was left under surveillance while a more rigorous identification procedure was prepared. In that room, Himmler remained seated for several minutes, under the constant gaze of two armed soldiers. He did not speak, he did not ask questions, he did not try to negotiate. He simply waited. This silence, far from being a sign of serenity, reflected a state of extreme tension. He knew that any poorly chosen word could hasten the revelation of his identity. He also knew that if he tried to use his former rank to intimidate or negotiate, his mask would crumble. For the first time in many years, he was devoid of real power. He could not command, he could not persuade, he could not invoke any authority. The room in which he waited was deliberately austere. There were no windows, just a closed door and a small ventilation grill near the ceiling. The lighting came from a single bulb hanging in the center, creating sharp shadows that accentuated the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The two soldiers guarding him held their rifles at rest, but their eyes never stopped watching him. They had been instructed to detect any suspicious movement, especially those directed towards the mouth or the neck, areas where lethal devices were typically concealed. The British then requested the presence of an officer specialized in identifying high-ranking Nazi officials, someone who knew the most wanted faces of the Reich and who had studied the physical modifications they might attempt to avoid being recognized. When this officer entered the interrogation room, he observed Himmler carefully. He did not need much time. Despite the emerging beard, extreme pallor, and visible fatigue, the general features matched the photographs he had seen repeatedly over the last few months. The elongated shape of the face, prominent cheekbones, narrow bridge of the nose, thin jaw, and, above all, the expression that mixed rigidity and tension, typical of a man accustomed to exercising control with bureaucratic coldness. To confirm his suspicions, he asked to compare Himmler's face with a series of photographs he carried with him. A quick but meticulous inspection was carried out. In each image, a different version of the Reichsführer SS appeared, in full uniform at official ceremonies, at meetings with other party leaders, during inspection visits to military facilities. The matches were too clear. The officer needed no confession. He simply crossed his arms and told the rest of the staff that they should reinforce the prisoner's custody, as he was an extremely important individual. It was then when Himmler, seeing that his disguise could no longer hold, spoke for the first time words that implicitly recognized who he was. He did not do it with arrogance or despair. It was an almost mechanical act, born of inevitability. He identified himself as Heinrich Himmler, former head of the SS. The silence that followed was heavy. In that small room, the presence of the man responsible for one of the most vast extermination systems in history caused an immediate impact, even among soldiers who did not know in detail the magnitude of his crimes. The revelation instantly transformed the atmosphere of the place. The soldiers guarding him hardened their stance, the officers exchanged meaningful looks, and the pace of operations accelerated. Everyone understood that they had before them one of the main architects of Nazi terror, someone whose name appeared in countless documents related to deportations, mass executions, and the administration of extermination camps. The responsibility of keeping him alive and under secure custody became a priority. The British reacted with professional discipline. There were no screams, no violence, or expressions of revulsion. They acted with methodical coldness. They knew that Himmler had to be interrogated, processed, and put under strict custody to prevent any suicide attempt. They removed any personal objects from him, checked his pockets thoroughly, and carefully examined his clothes for hidden devices. They also reinforced the surveillance around him, ensuring that there were always at least 2 soldiers less than 1 meter away. The possibility that Himmler was carrying a cyanide capsule remained high, and the British were determined to prevent what had already happened with other high-ranking captured Nazi leaders. The registration of his belongings revealed items that confirmed his identity beyond any doubt. Among his personal objects, they found a toothbrush with the initials HH discreetly engraved on the handle, a spare pair of glasses with a specific prescription that matched Himmler's medical records, and several partially destroyed documents containing notes in his characteristic handwriting. These findings were meticulously catalogued and kept as material evidence of the capture. With his identity confirmed, he was moved to another building where preliminary interrogations were conducted. This place was even more austere than the previous one. Bare walls painted in institutional grey, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 wooden chairs without cushions, a hanging lamp, and a small medical kit in a corner. Himmler was seated in front of the table and handcuffed so that he could not bring his hands to his mouth without being immediately noticed. The officer in charge sat in front of him, accompanied by a German interpreter who had served for months in the search for and identification of war criminals. The initial interrogation did not aim to obtain detailed confessions or high-level strategic information. Its purpose was to establish a clear basis for the subsequent transfer of the prisoner to more suitable facilities for extensive interrogation. He was asked about his escape attempt, the false identities he had used, his companions, and his exact whereabouts since the fall of Berlin. Himmler responded with bureaucratic precision that seemed automatic, a reflection of his administrative personality. He explained his movements in almost technical terms, as if he were still drafting a report for his superiors. He tried to present himself as someone who wished to cooperate, implying that he possessed valuable information about the structure of the former regime and about the political situation in Germany. What the British perceived at that moment was the profound psychological disconnection between the man speaking and the reality surrounding him. Himmler continued to use the tone of a high-ranking official, as if he expected to be treated with institutional respect based on his administrative experience. He had not understood that, for the Allies, he was not a valid interlocutor, but a prisoner involved in crimes of historical magnitude. This dissonance between his self-esteem and his real situation was reflected in every sentence. Despite the total defeat of the regime he had served, Himmler acted as if he could still influence his treatment, as if the hierarchy to which he had belonged still had some functional value. The British officer in charge of the interrogation took detailed notes, but showed no emotional reaction to Himmler's explanations. His role was to document, not to judge. However, it was evident that the prisoner did not understand the seriousness of his situation. When Himmler suggested that he could provide useful information about the internal organization of the SS and the state control mechanisms he had developed, the officer simply nodded without committing. There was no interest in negotiating privileges in exchange for cooperation. The information that Himmler could provide would be extracted through formal interrogation procedures, and any testimony would be evaluated in the context of a judicial process, not as part of an informal agreement. The interrogation was interrupted when the British officer ordered a second medical examination, this time more thorough and specific. The objective was to detect any hidden mechanism that Himmler could use to commit suicide, a common practice among high-ranking Nazis in the days following the surrender. Himmler was taken to another room, where a British military doctor, assisted by 2 orderlies, examined him thoroughly. They checked his mouth with medical instruments, exploring each molar, each interdental space, and the gums for anomalies. The examination was uncomfortable and deliberately invasive, designed to leave no possibility unchecked. During the examination, Himmler tried to resist passively, clenching his lips tightly each time the doctor attempted to access his oral cavity. The soldiers immobilized him by holding his shoulders and head, while the doctor used a metal mouth opener to force the jaw open. It was during this inspection that the doctor detected a slight deformation in a dental piece on the right side of the mouth. That anomaly, a slight bulge that did not correspond with the natural shape of the tooth, was enough to suspect that he was carrying a cyanide capsule embedded or attached in some way. Faced with that critical finding, the British took additional security measures. They decided that Himmler should remain under constant visual surveillance, without a single moment when there were not at least 2 pairs of eyes watching him. They prohibited him from closing his mouth completely without supervision, and established that any suspicious movement of the jaw or tongue should be reported immediately. The soldiers in charge of his custody were given specific instructions on how to react if the prisoner attempted to bite something. They were to restrain him immediately, force his mouth open, and attempt to manually remove any object before he could swallow it. However, these precautions, although strict, left inevitable margins of error. The tension of the moment, the accumulated fatigue of the British personnel after weeks of processing thousands of prisoners, and the speed with which the procedures occurred created windows of opportunity that a determined man could exploit. Himmler knew it. Throughout the inspection and registration process, he had been evaluating every moment, every distraction, every second in which the vigilance could be minimally relaxed. Throughout the following hours, Himmler did not completely lose his composure, but his appearance did visibly deteriorate. He no longer displayed the cold confidence he had exhibited for years as the administrator of terror. He had understood that he had no control over the situation, that the British were not interested in his proposals for cooperation, and that his fate did not depend on his will. His responses began to lose the previous precision. At times he repeated information, constructed incoherent sentences, or remained silent for extended periods. This psychological deterioration did not manifest in emotional outbursts, but in a kind of internal emptiness reflected in his fixed gaze, irregular breathing, and inability to maintain concentration. It is at this point where his public identity, the architect of one of the most vast systems of repression in history, directly confronted his individual identity, marked by fear and total loss of authority. The figure feared by millions was now reduced to an exhausted man, aware that any attempt to escape his responsibility was reaching its limit. The British decided to transfer him to Luneburg for a more formal and extensive interrogation. The journey that took him there marked the end of his stage as a fugitive and the beginning of his final hours of life, which would pass under the direct custody of officers who knew perfectly well who he was and what he represented in the history of the Third Reich. Death in Luneburg, the cyanide, the failed interrogation, and the reconstruction of the events. The transfer of Heinrich Himmler from Westertimke to Luneburg was carried out with the utmost discretion possible. The British had understood the importance of the prisoner, not only for his role as head of the SS, but because he symbolized the administrative heart of Nazi terror. His capture represented a critical point for the Allies in the narrative of the end of the Third Reich, and his survival was essential to clarify responsibilities and reconstruct the internal workings of the regime. But that intention would collide hours later with the determination that Himmler had with him since the last days of the war, to avoid at all costs facing a public trial. When they took him out of the initial processing center, he had already lost control over all his movements. He was handcuffed, guarded by soldiers who did not speak a word to him, aware that the only tool he still possessed was the cyanide capsule hidden in one of his molars. That tiny vial was, for him, the last frontier he could decide for himself. He knew that as long as he kept the possibility of using it, the British would not have absolute power over his fate. They arrived in Luneburg at dusk on the 23rd of May, 1945. The building that received them was a former administrative structure converted into an interrogation barrack for high-ranking Nazi officers. The lighting was minimal, the rooms narrow, and the hallways resonated with the constant steps of guards. Himmler was taken to a room where 2 British officers, a military doctor, and an interpreter awaited his arrival. The first objective of the team was clear: to prevent the prisoner from committing suicide. During the previous weeks, several high-ranking Nazi officers had managed to take their own lives using cyanide capsules. The interrogators wanted to prevent something similar from happening with Himmler. His testimony was considered a key piece for understanding the chain of command of the extermination. When he entered the room, Himmler was walking slightly hunched over, a result of the accumulated fatigue and the tension of the previous hours. His face showed a mix of resignation and alertness. He sat where he was instructed, surrounded by 4 armed soldiers who kept a short distance. The British officer in charge of the procedure began with formal matters: identity confirmation, review of personal data, rank, positions held during the Reich. Himmler responded in a neutral tone. He limited himself to answering just enough, without elaborating too much. He avoided mentioning details about operations, special units, or administrative decisions. His strategy was to give superficial information to buy time. However, the interrogation had not progressed much when the British doctor interrupted the process. He had been tasked with conducting a complete inspection of the prisoner to ensure he was not carrying any hidden lethal device. The procedure was exhaustive, checking clothes, belts, seams, pockets, mouth cavity inspection. It was at that moment when the scene took an unexpected turn. The doctor asked Himmler to stand up and open his mouth. The prisoner partially obeyed, barely parting his lips. The doctor leaned in to examine, but Himmler closed his mouth again tightly. This resistance was enough to alert those present. The British officer ordered the guards to hold him by the arms and the nape to allow a complete inspection. Himmler clenched his teeth firmly, aware that every second counted. The soldiers tried to force the jaw open. Himmler resisted with all his strength, keeping his mouth closed while the guards struggled to separate his jaws. During those seconds of intense struggle, the doctor shouted an urgent warning, but before they could complete the movement, there was a dry, almost imperceptible snap. The sound was unmistakable. It was the distinctive noise of a cyanide capsule breaking between the teeth. Himmler tilted his head forward, as if trying to swallow quickly. The guards reacted immediately. They held him by the shoulders, forced his jaw open, and the doctor tried to insert his hand to prevent him from completely swallowing the contents, but it was already too late. Within a few seconds, Himmler began to convulse. His breathing became irregular, and he produced a guttural sound. The poison acted with the characteristic speed of potassium cyanide. First, an intense burning in the mouth and throat, then a sudden closure of the airways, followed by a loss of muscle control. The military doctor tried to react with the available means. He ordered to place him on the stretcher, elevate the head, attempt a maneuver to induce vomiting, and check the oral cavity to determine if any residue remained. The scene was marked by shouted orders, rapid movements, and palpable tension. Himmler was already entering the critical phase of poisoning. The skin began to take on a greyish tone, the eyes sank slightly, and the heartbeats became irregular. The doctor tried to administer cardiac stimulants, but the poison had already penetrated the bloodstream. Efforts to revive him continued for several minutes. Chest compressions, artificial ventilation, adrenaline injections. Nothing worked. In less than 10 minutes since he had bitten the capsule, his breathing stopped. His face hardened into an expression that combined pain and a form of final determination. The British doctor continued trying emergency maneuvers, but finally officially declared the death. The time was recorded precisely, approximately 11:14 p.m. on the 23rd of May, 1945. The officers in the room were silent, surprised by the speed with which it had happened. For days they had tried to prevent exactly what had just happened, aware that Himmler's death would deprive the Allies of a key piece of information about the logistics of the genocide. Once the death was confirmed, the documentation procedures began. The soldiers noted every detail: the approximate time of ingestion, the physical reactions, the attempts at resuscitation, the final statement of the doctor, the position of the body. The personal items Himmler had carried with him were also recorded: a toothbrush, a pair of round glasses, a comb, a notepad, rank insignias, and the fake documents of Heinrich Himmler. All of these items were carefully packed. Himmler's corpse was placed on a stretcher and covered with a grey blanket. His face was partially visible, bluish lips, a light foam around the mouth. The cyanide capsule had left a characteristic smell, still noticeable in the room. The next step was forensic confirmation. The British could not afford any doubts. They had to demonstrate with absolute clarity that the dead man was Himmler, and that his death had been caused by his own action, not by negligence or external violence. A medical team examined the body. They confirmed the known physical characteristics: old scars, dental deformations, the shape of the jaw, the proportions of the face. They also verified the cause of death through the color of the internal tissues, the smell, and the chemical reaction of the poison. Everything matched. Once the identity was certified, an immediate decision arose: what to do with the body. The Allied policy in those days was clear: to avoid any possibility that the grave of a high-ranking Nazi leader would become a rallying point for sympathizers. The British decided to proceed in the same manner as with other Nazi leaders. His body would be buried in an unknown location, without a visible marker, without a public record. On the 24th of May, at dawn, a small group of soldiers transported the corpse wrapped in a tarpaulin. They left the barracks and headed to the outskirts of Luneburg. The operation was not announced, it was not officially photographed, and no precise record of the location was kept. Later accounts would agree on a wooded area, but without verifiable coordinates. There, in a hastily dug grave, they placed the body without any ceremony. They covered it with soil, compacted it, and erased any visible trace. With that act, Himmler's physical presence in the history of the Reich came to an end. His death did not cause a stir within the German population, which at that moment was facing the absolute devastation of the country. For the British command, his suicide represented a significant loss of information that could have been crucial in future trials. His testimony would have helped fill gaps about internal decisions, chains of command, and administrative orders related to the machinery of extermination. What remained of Himmler, beyond the body buried in secret, was the political and repressive structure he had led for years. His physical disappearance eliminated the possibility of attributing responsibilities to him through confessions, but did not erase the documentary evidence that demonstrated his central role in the organization of the genocide. The cyanide capsule also sealed his final escape, that of facing his own past before a court. The erased trail, the fate of the body, the official silence, and the historical construction of its end. The death of Heinrich Himmler in Luneburg did not only end the life of the administrative architect of the Nazi extermination system. It also opened the door to a deliberate process of physical, documentary, and symbolic disappearance driven by the British to prevent his figure from becoming a reference point for sympathizers or nostalgists of the defeated regime. This final chapter, marked by the absence of ceremonies, by reserved reports, and by calculated decisions, reveals to what extent the Allies understood the risk of allowing the remains of the former Reichsführer SS to acquire a political or propagandistic value. Once Himmler was secretly buried, his body ceased to exist for the public sphere. There was no formal autopsy published, no official photographs widely disseminated, no detailed statement from the British authorities explaining the exact fate of the remains. The silence surrounding these events was part of a policy designed to erase any physical trace that could fuel later mythologies. The Allied powers knew that, even in total defeat, Nazism retained scattered followers who could try to transform any vestige, a body, a place, a personal object, into a symbol of resistance or martyrdom. The way Himmler's body was managed was, in that sense, a continuation of the effort to dismantle not only the structure of the Third Reich, but also its capacity to project itself into the future. The first step of this process was the creation of an extremely concise and restricted internal report. It recorded the identity of the prisoner, the precise circumstances of the suicide, the medical confirmation of death, and the decision to proceed with a secret burial. No exact coordinates were detailed, no location map was included, and no written confirmation from a hierarchical superior was requested. The British opted for a brief document, sufficient for internal administrative use, but insufficient to be used as a public or accessible historical reference. In this way, they ensured that the grave where Himmler was laid to rest remained out of any future search, both by sympathizers and by historians or journalists. The absence of an accurate record had immediate and lasting consequences. Even within the British military apparatus itself, very few officers knew exactly where it had been buried. The soldiers who participated in the operation were explicitly instructed not to discuss the matter under any circumstances, and once the task was completed, they returned to their units without retaining specific details or written documents. The objective was simple and clear: to prevent anyone from being able to reconstruct the burial place in the future through fragmented accounts or scattered testimonies. The individual memory of those present was to be the only vestige, and human memory, by nature, is inaccurate, variable, and easily eroded by time. Meanwhile, in London and in the Allied command centres in Europe, Himmler's death generated mixed reactions among intelligence officers and the planners of the war trials. For some, his suicide represented an immediate relief. It avoided the need to organize a complex, long, and media-heavy trial that would have required the presentation of thousands of documents, hundreds of witnesses, and a judicial process of extremely high international visibility. For others, however, his death constituted a significant and irreparable loss of crucial information. Himmler had access to the deepest levels of the Nazi repressive apparatus. He knew how the deportations had been designed, who had signed the key orders, how the extermination camps operated, what methods had been used to maintain collaboration with various civil and military institutions. His testimony would have been crucial to complete the judicial and historical puzzle that was just beginning to be reconstructed. But beyond the internal evaluations, the general guideline was to prevent his death from being transformed into a public narrative with heroic or tragic elements that could be politically exploited. The German people, in May of 1945, faced a devastated country, cities in ruins, millions of displaced people, extreme rationing, diseases, and a full military occupation. Himmler's figure did not hold a priority place in the immediate concerns of the population, but the Allies knew that certain ideological groups might attempt to reclaim his memory in the medium or long term. Therefore, they chose to provide a strictly necessary and minimal official version: that Himmler had been captured, correctly identified, and had committed suicide by poison. Nothing more. No additional details were provided, no extensive press conferences were held, no photographs of the corpse were distributed. This official silence marked the beginning of a process that, over time, would turn its end into a dark and little discussed point within the historical accounts of the immediate post-war period. While figures like Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, or Wilhelm Keitel were subjected to exhaustive public trials that culminated in death sentences or long sentences meticulously documented, Himmler was left out of that judicial scenario, disappearing from public view even before the international proceedings in Nuremberg began. This absence had an immediate historical consequence. Himmler became the only high-ranking leader of the Third Reich whose historical responsibility was not formally debated before an international tribunal. His death closed that door abruptly and irreversibly. After the disposal of his body, there remained a second administrative task: managing the documents, personal belongings, and records that had been held in British custody. Items such as his toothbrush with engraved initials, glasses with specific prescription, forged documents, and pieces of the uniform were stored in British military archives without a clear or systematic plan for their future preservation or public display. Some of these items would later be studied by historians or preserved in official museum collections, but many others were catalogued inaccurately or even lost, contributing to the dispersal and, in certain cases, irreversible loss of potentially relevant material. The priority of the British was not to preserve Himmler's personal belongings for posterity. It was to document only what was strictly necessary to close the administrative file and continue with the prosecution of other war criminals. Simultaneously, technical questions arose about the cyanide capsule he had used. From the early days after his death, various officials speculated about how he had successfully concealed it, despite the numerous medical examinations he underwent. The most plausible explanation, later confirmed by forensic analysis, was that the capsule was embedded between a dental piece and the gum, deliberately hidden in a way that required an extremely meticulous dental examination with specialized instruments. Himmler had received cyanide capsules for years, as a standard measure for high-ranking Nazis, and had been specifically instructed on how to use them and hide them without allowing easy detection through superficial inspections. This practice was common among the regime's elite, which explained why so many leaders managed to commit suicide before or during their capture, frustrating Allied attempts to bring them to justice. Another important element in the subsequent construction of his end was the German reaction, or rather, the absence of it. Unlike Hitler's death, which generated contradictory rumors, conspiracy theories, and divergent accounts for decades, Himmler's suicide was accepted relatively quickly and without significant controversy. This was partly because by May of 1945, the country was too busy trying to survive physically and emotionally to develop a collective discourse about its former leaders. Furthermore, Himmler's political disrepute was profound, even among former supporters of Nazism. Many military personnel considered him to be an incompetent intruder in matters of military strategy. Others saw him as directly responsible for crimes they preferred not to remember or associate with their own participation in the regime. His fall from grace with Hitler and his failed and desperate attempt to negotiate with the Allies had made him an uncomfortable figure even within the regime itself during its final days. While Himmler's body disappeared into an unmarked anonymous grave, his historical responsibility emerged with more clarity every day. As the Allies liberated concentration camps, seized complete archives, and took detailed testimony from survivors, his name appeared recurrently as the signature behind fundamental decisions. Administrative orders, bureaucratic decrees, internal reports, and direct correspondence revealed the depth of his involvement in the deportation, mass murder, and systematic exploitation of human beings. His physical disappearance did not prevent his legacy from being documented with an almost clinical precision in thousands of pages of evidence. Over the years, the figure of Himmler transformed into a particular symbol within the historical analysis of the Third Reich. He did not represent the charismatic power of Hitler, nor the propagandist political ambition of Goebbels, nor the incompetent militarism of Göring. Himmler embodied another dimension, that of the obsessive bureaucrat, the cold and methodical organizer who turned ideological ideas into administrative systems of death. His death by cyanide precisely reinforced that image, a final calculated act that deliberately avoided any public confrontation and at the same time preserved the logic of absolute control that had guided his life. By disappearing in silence, Himmler left a significant void in the Nuremberg trials. The prosecutors had to reconstruct his role from documents, indirect testimonies, and administrative structures. What would have been a direct confrontation with the man who had designed part of the genocidal system had to become a technical reconstruction, without the physical presence of the responsible party. His absence also prevented him from being interrogated on key issues: the internal discussions about the final solution, the coordination mechanisms between the SS and the Ministry of the Interior, the communications with the camp commanders, and the direct orders he had given to the Einsatzgruppen. In the post-war period, the silence about his grave became a symbolic element. Unlike other leaders whose bodies were buried, exhumed, or studied, Himmler completely disappeared. No official map contains the place. No public record records the pit. No photograph shows the final destination. His physical trace evaporated in a deliberate act by the Allies, who understood that the resting place of a Nazi leader should never become a meeting point, memory, or claim for extremist groups. The official silence also contributed to the proliferation of unconfirmed versions, rumors, and contradictory accounts during the following decades. Some claimed that he had been buried in a forest near Luneburg. Others suggested an open area on the outskirts of the city. Some even asserted that he had been incinerated, although there is no documentary evidence to support that version. These contradictions were the direct result of the Allied decision not to publicly record the burial. The mystery, although minor compared to other aspects of the end of the Third Reich, persisted as part of the historical account of its end. Over time, however, the exact location ceased to have historiographical relevance. The documentation on his life, his role in the Reich, and his responsibility in the extermination system was so overwhelming that the fate of his body became secondary. What mattered was not where he had been buried, but the incontrovertible evidence of his role in the machinery of genocide. His missing grave became, unintentionally, an apt metaphor, a void in the earth for a man whose life had produced, through bureaucratic decisions, millions of deeper voids. The historical closure of his figure was consolidated with the progressive opening of archives and the publication of specialized studies that detailed his importance within the Nazi apparatus. What the British had avoided, turning his death into a public act, also prevented a heroic or vindicative narrative from arising from extremist sectors. Himmler had no grave, no funeral, no farewell. His end was an act of physical disappearance in line with the moral and institutional destruction of the regime he had served. Today, the place where he lies remains unknown, and it probably will be forever. That anonymity is not an accident. It is the result of a conscious political decision to prevent the last trace of the Reichsführer SS from becoming a symbol. His story, however, remains intact in archives, testimonies, and analyses that reconstruct, with ruthless clarity, the extent of his responsibility. Thus concludes Himmler's journey in the physical world, not in a court, not in front of the eyes of the victims, not in a judicial process that would reveal every detail of his crimes, but in an unmarked grave that represents both an administrative closure and a political declaration. His legacy, on the other hand, was exposed to the light of the post-war period, subject to historical scrutiny and the analysis of a humanity determined to understand how one individual could transform bureaucracy into an instrument of death.